Don't adjust your volume. A version of American Sign Language interpreting the Shema, which is also in this extraordinary Torah portion, which is essentially a highlight reel of so many of the liturgical pieces that are so precious to the Jewish people. A little further on, after the Ten Commandments, is the Shema and the Ve'ahavta. And the Shema, of course, calls on us to hear, is the general translation, but so poignant for those who physically cannot hear. But another way of interpreting the word Shema is, as in the American Sign Language version by a marvelous inspirational rabbi, Rabbi Darby Jared Leigh, pay attention. Israel, the sign for the land, but he adds the gathering of the people. God, our God, God, and not just the sign for one, but he chooses many into one. Let's do it again. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Just a few days ago, on July 26th, this country observed, a little bit quietly, given everything going on, the 30th anniversary of President George H.W. Bush's signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Modeled on the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, the ADA is the most comprehensive disability rights legislation in history. Its employment provisions prohibit discrimination in job application procedures, hiring, advancement, termination, compensation, job training, and other terms, conditions, and privileges of employment. It was a landmark decision. Jennifer Sheehy, who is the Deputy Assistant Director of the Office of Disability Employment Policy, it's a mouthful, said just a few days ago, the ADA ushered in a new era of opportunity for Americans with disabilities. Instead of being excluded from opportunities to contribute their skills and talents, Americans with disabilities gained access to places and public services heretofore inaccessible, such as employment and training programs that were not possible before the ADA. The Office of Disability Employment Policy will continue to work alongside our stakeholders as we pursue the goal of full inclusion in America's workplaces, she said. That has certainly not always been the case in our workplaces, and we need to be honest, it has not always been the case for houses of worship, particularly houses of Jewish worship. We are a tradition that celebrates ableism, intellectual capability, and for a long time, people who were deaf were considered in rabbinic literature to be on the level of a minor child and a shotet, one who was mentally deficient. The cheresh, the deaf-mute, categorized often with those of mental deficiency and children. That went on for a terribly long time. In a statement by the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the Rabbinical Assembly, written by Rabbi Pamela Barmash in 2011, it was a strong and full-throttle endorsement of inclusion in the Jewish community of people who are deaf. But in analyzing the rabbinic literature, the conclusion was that the clear implication was that those who were both deaf and could not speak were not of sound mind. They were disqualified, excluded, and recategorized as being unable to conduct themselves as equal to other human beings. It was said that they lacked bar da'at, lucidity, or the ability to be children, if you will, of knowledge. Rabbi Barmash, in the language of our time, addressed the question in 2011 of could physical gestures and mouthed words be accepted as halachic prayer. She referred particularly to the Shema for its irony of the need to, as we generally translate, hear, O Israel, that Adonai is God and Adonai is one. Referring to the Shema, she wrote, articulating the Shema or other prayers with the movement of the mouth is more than simply embodying the physical act of speech. By following the halachic requirement to recite prayers aloud, even if too softly to hear, we propel ourselves to focus on our prayers. We center ourselves and concentrate in a way distinct from reading a fixed text quietly and internally to ourselves. The physical gestures of speech impress us to concentrate. If the physical act of moving our mouths in speech does so, the gestures of sign language do so even more. Sign language, she argued, is therefore a perfect substitute for oral articulation in prayer and may be used to fulfill the requirement for the physical articulation of the words of the Shema. In a vote of 16-0, the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards accepted this proposal. It is true that the Torah tells us, do not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 14. But it just hasn't always been the case. We do have texts of inclusivity, but over the centuries, we've had a lot of work to do. Professor Naomi Sokoloff teaches a course called Hebrew Poems and Prayers at the University of Washington, and she was particularly struck by a version of the Ve'ahavta put forth by Jewish Deaf Multimedia. She draws our attention to two signs in the Ve'ahavta. The first is, you shall bind them as a sign upon your hand. This was interpreted by the rabbis to refer ultimately to laying tefillin, the leather straps of the phylacteries that are bound on the arm, not on Shabbat, but on regular days. And the sign for bind them as a sign is this. And then upon your hand. So beautiful to embody the mitzvah that the rabbis took from this biblical text, incorporating it into this motion. We'll do it again. Bind them for a sign upon your hand. So beautiful. She writes, in American Sign Language, binding on the hand is vividly enacted, mimicking the action of laying tefillin, bringing the connection between the words of the text and Jewish custom. The other piece that struck her most to the heart is this notion of with all your might, uvechol me'odecha. It's a strange word in Hebrew and it's hard to translate, but in American Sign Language it's rendered like this, with all your might. Imagine if we could do that every time we did the Shema and the Ve'ahavta. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, and do it with all our might to bind these words as a sign upon our hands. It immediately sends a ripple of energy through the body that is so different than just saying or chanting the words. Professor Sokolov says, ASL has its own distinctive poetic qualities, qualities achieved through movement, three-dimensionality, and semantic layers that have no exact equivalent in spoken or written English. These infused the sign Shema with a unique kind of immediacy and vitality. These signs serve as a reminder that the deaf have much to teach the hearing world about language and perception. Those of us who are not hearing impaired can learn from American Sign Language to hear Shema Yisrael and grasp how understanding of traditional prayer can be enhanced through grappling with a new translation, that of sign language. The Shema calls upon Jewish people to recognize and acknowledge the diverse manifestations of one God. And ASL renders the Shema to serve as a beautiful and potent reminder to honor diversity. On this 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, it is incumbent upon us to remember to do the same, to bring to true and vibrant life words that we often say as we welcome the Shabbat evening, and let us live up to these words. May the door of these worship spaces be wide enough, inclusive enough to receive all who hunger for love, all who seek fellowship. May this worship space, this virtual community, be for all who enter it, the doorway to a richer and more meaningful life. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Ken Yehi Ratzon. Shabbat Shalom.